In this video, we are going to discuss variables, identifiers, and also a variable type called int. So in C++, we have the option of creating variables. And so an example of this is we can type something like int and then a variable name. And so in this case, I'll just put num because we're just creating a number. Int is a word that specifies what type the variable name coming after it is going to be. So in this case, like I said, we've created a variable named num, and it is of type int. Int is short for integer, and what that means is that num can hold any whole number. So it can hold 7, num can hold 2000, num can hold -9, and if we put in a decimal, we can see that we don't get any error. There's no red squigglies. But what will happen is if we were to demonstrate outputting num at each of these points, so just like this, so let's go ahead and run it. And now we can see that we get 7, 2000, and in this case, all outputs is 6. So this is something that's very important to know about the data type of num, or excuse me, the data type of int, is that it truncates. It does not round. So we can put 6.9 in, 6.97, we can put anything in that we want, and it will still only store 6. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly happens when we declare a variable. So there are 3 steps in every, or there are 3 different ways to work with variables in a sense. The first that we need to cover is defining a variable, and that's what I've done here. I have defined a variable num, specifically of type int. But right now, num doesn't hold any value. So if we were to try and output num right now, let's go ahead and run it. And it says there were build errors. And if we go up and if we view these errors, it says uninitialized local variable num used. So even though we don't get the red squigglies right here, we actually should. So really what this is saying is num only holds garbage. There's just garbage value in there. It's a placeholder. Num has no value at this point. And so trying to output that garbage value is impossible. And so now we need to do one of 2 things. We need to either initialize the variable, and initialization is done at the same step as the definition. So if we do int num equals 7, we have just initialized num to be 7. So now we can go ahead and run it by pressing Control F5, and sure enough we get 7. The other option is we can simply assign a value to num. So we can do num equals 8. And so in this step you can see that we've got int num, we have our definition, and right here is our assignment. And so those can take place either at the same time or at another time, or at separate times. But it's important to note that we cannot now do int num equals 7. And so if we go up and we start without debugging, then once again we get there were build errors. If we look at the error list, it says int num redefinition. So you can only define a variable once. So once again, even though we aren't getting the red squigglies at this point, we really should. There should be red squigglies there letting us know that this was a redefinition. And so we're going to go ahead and just delete that. So what we've created here with this num, this is, like I mentioned, a variable. It's just a placeholder that allows us to store values. But it is also something called an identifier. And an identifier is a programmer-defined name. And so that includes everything that we do in programming, actually. Main is an identifier because we've created this function called main. Int is an identifier that a different programmer came up with. So really the things that we need to focus on in terms of our identifiers are the names that we come up with, like in this case num, or if I create a character letter equals C. Then once again, letter is a variable that we've created, but it's also an identifier, specifically to say that this is a character. So it's important when creating variables to come up with good variable names, have good identifiers. The most important thing about this is that they need to be meaningful. And so in this case, I have int num, and while that's somewhat meaningful in that we know that num will hold a number, we don't know anything about this number. And so instead, if we were to be doing something with days of the week, then we might call this days in a week. And we can say equals 7, because that's how many days there are in a week. And so that lets any other programmer who looks at my code and sees this, days in a week, they immediately know that this variable is storing however many days there are in a week. And so you can see that this is far more useful than just having int num. One thing that is important to know with variable names is that there are some rules associated with this. They must be made up of letters, numbers, and they can be made up of letters, numbers, and the underscore. So an example would be, let's just stick with days in a week. So we can use the underscore. We can even start with the underscore. Int days, or we can have days in a week 7 equals 7. But we cannot have int 7 days in a week. You cannot start a variable with or any identifier for that matter. You cannot start an identifier with a number. Something else important to note is that they are case sensitive. So if we do int num and int num or int num or any combination, these are all different variables, and they are, once again, case sensitive. So let's go ahead and take a look at some other things that we can do with variables. One thing that's kind of cool is that if you are declaring or defining multiple variables of the same type, we can actually do it all on the same line using the comma. For example, and I'm going to just use num and num1 and so on and so forth in this example. So just ignore the not great identifier names there. We've got int num, num1, num2, num3, num4, and we can do this up to num(n), really, if we wanted to. And all of these will get defined and declared at this point. And we can even do initialization at this stage. And we can, we don't have to initialize all of them. We can just initialize some of them. And that will still work. And so let's make num1 equal to -2. And then now we can see out num and end line, and we can see out num1 and end line, and we can see out num2 and then end line, and then I can see out num3 and then an end line, right? And hopefully you're shaking your head and saying, no, of course not. Because if we look right here, num3 does not have a value yet. So this does not work. We cannot output num3 at this point. But we can change this and output num4 instead. And then we'll go ahead and run it by pressing Control F5. And it builds successfully, and we can see 8, -2, 5, and 6, which is exactly what we should be seeing.